That new song is, it's a wonderful reality that he is faithful and just. Most of our worship this morning kind of leaned into that. You know, we've been working through this series just to know the Lord better, the fact that he does stand apart from all others. He is like no other. He is absolutely holy in his nature, pure in all ways, perfect in form, and perfect in his activities. We talked about that a few weeks ago, God's purity, his holiness. And then we move from there to his righteousness. Not only is he pure and holy and separate in all that he is, but also all that he does. Everything he does is absolutely righteous in relating to himself and to his creation, to us. And we were challenged with God's righteousness as we kind of keep moving through this series. We can't help but look at the juxtaposition between his character, his nature, and our own. And so our righteousness in light of his reveals something not only about himself, but about ourselves. And it gives us opportunity to do a little bit of self-evaluation, some self-reflection to consider what are the areas in which I need to learn and grow and change my attitudes and my behavior. Last week we talked about God's justice. The harsh reality for me last week is that I want God's justice, but I want it to extend just short of myself. Anybody else get there as we kind of thought through that a little bit? I want God's justice to be poured out. I want wicked people to pay for their sins, but I kind of only want that for people that are more wicked than myself, right? Now, I want God's justice, and then I want it to lap up just short of my toes. Because I don't want God's full justice, because I know that would include myself. And so that reality is a hard one to wrestle with, especially in a week like we had last week, a difficult week that just kind of shined a bright light on the evil that pervades our society and our culture. Today I want to wrap up this series by looking at another attribute of God. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, actually, probably more than normal, maybe not at a greater pace, but certainly across a broader scope. Instead of reading like one book and kind of working my way through it and then focusing on another, I'm reading through a whole bunch of books on a number of different subjects right now, trying to keep them sorted in my head. Gives me lots to think about as I'm driving or mowing the lawn or different things like that. One of the books that I'm looking at right now challenges me as a parent. Sarah and I are working through it together with our small group, and it's all about parenting adult children. And so it gives us opportunity to reflect on the roles, the responsibilities, the approaches to parenting that Sarah and I have kind of engaged in over the past 22 years or so. But now as our children are adults, our role has to shift a little bit, and that's not easy for our children or for us. And so it's giving us opportunity to kind of think through our parenting for the next season or the season that we've stepped into, and just ask some hard questions. What are some things we've done right? What are some things maybe that we've done that we could have improved on? And what are some ways that we need to step into the next 10, 20, 30 years in a little bit different role? Are there some things about our character, our attitudes, and that sort of stuff that we need to adjust? One of the books that I'm reading is pushing me to kind of reconsider how I think of my approach to sharing my faith with people who don't know Jesus yet. Many years ago, we lived in a country where most people identified themselves as being Christian. And then as people kind of stopped going to church and moved away from that, even if people didn't consider themselves Christians, they were at least Christian adjacent, right? They held some of the same values, most of the same values in life that the Bible teaches. And so when we lived in a nation where most people were at least Christian friendly, our our approach to sharing our faith and encouraging somebody to step into a relationship with Jesus looked very differently than it does now. We now live in a society that is not Christian friendly. We live in a world now, in a culture that's skeptical of Christianity and its values, and skeptical, and maybe even we could say hostile toward you and I as disciples of Jesus. And our approach to reach a person who doesn't trust us and doesn't trust our values, doesn't embrace or even like what we stand for, our approach to reach that person for Christ, because as far as I read, there's not a new chapter in the Bible saying, well, they're mean to you, so now you're not held to that whole Great Commission thing. We're still called to reach them. We have to adjust our approaches. And so I'm reading a book that's kind of, taking everything that I've learned over 49 years about evangelism, and it's just kind of turning it inside out. And it's forcing me to do some reevaluation there. I'm reading a book that's all about how worship shapes our souls and grows us toward greater Christ-likeness. To think of about my time engaging in worship, not just from singing songs that I like and leaning into styles that I appreciate, or paying closer attention to the words that I'm singing, but how do I allow the activity of praising God, how do I allow it to transform me? So I'm doing a lot of reading, and it's a lot of reading that's forcing me to ask questions about myself, kind of give some self-assessment, ask some probing questions, maybe even invite others into that process to say, what do you see in me that ought to be addressed or be made aware of? Do I have blind spots? That brings about a lot of change, or at least the potential for a lot of change in me. And as I do that, I know that change can be beneficial. It can also sometimes be harmful. I think back to when I was a 7th grader, there was a whole lot of change that year in my life. We moved from a small town to a bigger town. I went from a tiny little elementary school to a very large middle school that was much more diverse. It was in the suburbs of a larger city, and so there was a lot of different types of thought and philosophies and politics that I had never been exposed to. Not only that, but I was a 7th grade boy, so I was physically changing, and my whole world was just kind of topsy-turvy for a while, and I made new friends, and I kind of jumped into this new school, and that year, maybe more changes in me and around me than I'd ever experienced before, and some of those changes were really good. They were necessary. Some of the changes that I made in that year were not beneficial, right? So change is inevitable for us. Sometimes it's good, sometimes maybe not so much. The Bible tells us that we serve a God that is unchanging. That's what I want to talk about this morning. In a world that is constantly changing or evolving, God remains the same. I'll tell you that our thoughts this morning came out of another book that I've spent a lot of time in, especially over the past couple weeks. J.I. Packer is an Anglican minister, was an Anglican minister. He wrote a book entitled Knowing God. And in that book, there's one chapter on the immutability of God, that characteristic, that part of his nature that tells us that he is unchanging over all of history, over all of eternity. Change makes something or someone either better or worse, right? If you're not staying the same, you're moving one direction or the other. God can become neither. If God can get better, then he wasn't God. He wasn't perfect in all that he is, or was, at least. If he gets worse, then that also disqualifies him from being a holy, perfect, moral being. So God cannot change. By his nature, he must stay the same. Everything else around us only changes. This is one of the ways in which he's holy. Everything around us changes. Alive or not is in a process of transformation. But the Bible tells us that God does not change, that his person is perfect. And in that, we know him to be immutable or without change. He doesn't grow, he doesn't learn, he doesn't mature or evolve. He also doesn't age or weaken or wane in any sort of way. He is as he has always been and will always be. Psalm 92 says, "From everlasting to everlasting, you are God," present tense. Psalm 102, verses 25 to 27 say it this way: "In the beginning, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they'll be discarded. But you remain the same, and your years will never end." What a beautiful picture of the Creator and his creation here from Psalm 102. I don't know if you have a favorite t-shirt that should have been retired 10 years ago. I've had several over the years. My wife is gracious enough to tell me when I put one on or come home from the grocery store, and she's like, "You still have that?" That's how I know now. Before, she had to tell me a little more directly, but we've been married 25 years, so I pick up on subtle cues now like I didn't before. "Oh, you still have that shirt. What is it you like about that shirt?" Apparently nothing, right? And we just discard it. We think of creation as pretty stable. Of the cosmos as fairly permanent. I don't know what theory of creation you ascribe to, whether creation is 6,000 years old or 600 billion or whatever we might say on the other end of things. It feels fairly permanent. It feels fairly substantial. We are such a tiny force in this massive cosmos that as on a whole, over its entire scope, the universe feels like it provides a fairly stable foundation for us. But the Bible tells us that it will wear out like a garment, like that old college t-shirt. That eventually the Lord will discard it and move on to something else, but that he remains the same forever. James 1:17 puts a personal spin on it for us. "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." He is the same as he has always been. He says to his people directly in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, "I, the Lord, do not change. So you descendants of Jacob are not destroyed." God does not, he cannot change from what and who he has eternally been. That reality, that truth that God cannot change from what and who he has always been, brings with it certain ramifications. There are other truths that kind of come saddled to that basic reality. This morning, I'd like for us to consider three assurances that we can have because God is unchanging. He is immutable. He will never stray from what he has been. And the first of those is that his behaviors are absolutely consistent. If God doesn't change, if he is as he has always been, then he will do as he has always done. We talked about that at the very beginning of the series, that God acts out of his nature, that he does associated with what he is or who he is. And while that is a big concept that we can only partially grasp and understand, the reality is that if God is unchanging, if he is immutable, if we know that today he is exactly the same, that he has always been for all of eternity, then we know that he will act as he has always acted. And that gives us some comfort. Today, if you're a fill-in-the-blanks note taker with us, I want you to pay particular attention to the words that are in the blanks this morning, because they carry with them certain significance. If God's behaviors are consistent, we can understand about him that his practices, everything he does, all of his activities are entirely faithful. If he doesn't change, then what he does also doesn't change according to who he is. If God is immutable, his practices, or how he behaves and how he acts, will be faithful to who he has always been. And for us, the consequences of that is that we can start to recognize when it's God doing the activity and when it's someone else or something else. You see, his consistency in how he behaves and what he does should become more recognizable as we become more familiar with him. As we interact with his unchanging nature and we see how consistent and faithful he is in his behavior, we should be able to more quickly pick up on what God's doing. Therefore, we would then be able to respond appropriately. When God acts, we can step in and join him in what he's doing. Saul, we're told, named first king over Israel, started off in his role as a faithful, God-fearing man. But his power, his authority, his influence, the wealth and the benefits and all the perks of the job that came with it quickly began to corrupt Saul's character. He began to get distracted and caught up. His ego began to grow with his influence over God's people, his control and power and authority over them. And at one point in Saul's reign, he made some decisions that violated God's moral laws. Now, that's not uncommon, right? We all do that. But when Saul was confronted with his sin, his response was disappointing, to say the least. You see, when Saul was confronted with his sin, he tried to justify his behaviors. He tried to explain away why even though he violated God's moral code, in this particular circumstance, it made sense to do so. That he was right in disobeying God in those circumstances. Not only did he try to justify it, but he tried to explain it away. He tried to cast blame on other people. Well, the reason he had to do this was because God's other servant hadn't shown up in time. He was late to the party. And after he tried to cast blame on other people, Saul was concerned about his public reputation with his other leaders, military and political, that then Saul just begged that God's prophet would just kind of sweep the whole thing under the rug, that he wouldn't say anything publicly about Saul's shame. And so Saul tried to justify, he tried to blame others, he tried to make his wrongful activities and deeds just go away and disappear. And from that, we see the real light is cast on Saul's character. You see, he was no longer a man who followed after God's heart. He didn't desire God's will as much as his own. He was less concerned with God's glory and what people's opinion was of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he was more concerned with his own reputation. And so at this point, God decides to remove Saul from his leadership. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 29, we read, "He who is the glory of Israel," speaking of God, "does not change. does not lie or change his mind. For he is not a human being that he should change his mind. You see, in this particular instance, God was requiring of the person chosen to lead his nation that person would be a person of great integrity. It would be an individual who lived righteously, who carried out God's law no matter how popular or unpopular it might seem. And Saul failed in that regard, and so God was going to replace him. God was bringing someone else to the surface, a person in young David. This verse in 1 Samuel says that the Lord does not lie. He does not change his mind. You read this verse, and some of you are saying, now wait a minute, I know there are some specific cases in the Bible where God does in fact change his mind. How do we make sense of those instances where the Bible tells us that God relented or God changed his mind? If you go back to those instances, you'll see that God changed his mind or changed his intended course as individuals either abandon God or come back to him, repent of their sinful ways and return to God. And there are cases where God had in mind to do one thing, but because of human beings, either repentant spirit or lack thereof, God changed course of direction. But what God didn't do in those cases was change his standards, his precepts, his moral code of conduct. You see, God remained the same in who he was, even though he changed course in what he was doing on earth. He changed his behavior consistent with his person, consistent with his principles. His standards and precepts are static. They always have been. God is not one to move his moral goalposts, either for us to find it easier to meet his standards, or for them to be more difficult. God's morality is God's morality. His standards will never change. What he has written into the moral code of this universe will be forever. Psalm 119, verses 151 and 152 says, "Yet you are near, Lord, and your commands are true. Long ago I learned this from your statutes, that you established them, your statutes, your commands, to last forever." This is why God is absolutely relatable. It's because he's trustworthy. Whether we like his stances, his precepts, and his commands, or dislike them, they are consistent. They do not change. They do not move based on popular opinion. They do not adjust based on our ability to meet those standards or not. They are consistent. They are immovable. At the end of Hebrews, we're encouraged, the church is encouraged to be consistent with our religious behavior, or our righteous behavior. We're encouraged to live in a way that is consistent and constant as our Heavenly Father, even when we're persecuted. Hebrews 13, verses 6 to 8 says, "So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" I think as we live in a world that grows increasingly hostile toward Christian values, biblical standards, this is an attitude. This is something that we're going to have to embrace more all the time. From there, the author of Hebrews goes on to encourage us, "Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The author of Hebrews understands what we're talking about this morning, that he has been, is, and always will be who he has declared himself to be. His person does not change. His standards do not change. He is the same as others have found him to be. So not only do we find that his practices are faithful, but we find that his personality is also consistent. Thinking back to my 7th grade self, that year where all these changes were happening in my world, my friends and I were also changing. We were physically changing, we were emotionally changing, trying to mature. We were so fickle and inconsistent. There were days where we seemed more like adults, and other days we were right back to being children in our thinking and our processing, our responding to the world. We weren't consistent in our personalities. It was an emotional roller coaster some days, wasn't it? But we know from the scriptures that God's personality is consistent, and that makes him relatable to us. That means we can begin to find stability in who he is and how he interacts with his perfect triune self, but also how he interacts with each of us. And we can begin to recognize and relate to him in a way that is fit for eternity. Now, that doesn't mean we always understand it perfectly. There have been plenty of people who have misunderstood who God is. Because of their interactions with him or their interpretation of what he's doing in their lives, there are times where we misread who God is. But if we take those circumstances and we lay them against the fabric of the scriptures, we begin to see this consistency through his person, through his personality. Your word, Lord, is eternal. It stands firm in the heavens, according, again, to Psalm 119. Verse 90 says, your faithfulness continues through all generations. You establish the earth, and it endures. Your faithfulness. There are times in our lives where the circumstances we find ourselves in are incredibly uncomfortable, very difficult. Where we begin to wonder, God, are you there? I'm crying out to you, and I'm not seeing the answers that I anticipate or that I desire from you. And I begin to wonder, is God truly faithful? We read in the scriptures from other men and women who have walked through similarly difficult circumstances. They ask earnest questions of the Lord. If you read through their writings, you'll see that those who are faithful place their trust in the Lord throughout those circumstances. And they write after the fact to God's faithfulness. They find God to be as he has declared himself to be, absolutely faithful. That even in difficult, trying circumstances, he walks with us. He develops in us character. He provides for us core needs. We know that God experienced life in full through the incarnate Son, just as each of us. He knows our struggles. He was able to show us that discipline and self-control are possible in the most trying of times. And he calls us to righteous living that matches his, that mirrors his own, that we might also be consistent and relatable in our struggles. In James chapter 1, it says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted, nor by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And so I would ask you, just like I'm kind of working through the process myself, how consistent are you in your Christian walk? Last week, that was where I was wrestling. I want certain justice for some individuals and use different scales for others based on how much I agree with them or how much I like their personalities. how deep my relationship is with them. Sometimes when I'm here at church, I carry myself a certain way. I'm expected to be a leader, to be an example, to speak on behalf of God. And so I walk in this door and I kind of take on that responsibility. And then I drive out of here and I've got lots of things to do, and some of you drive too slowly, and that character quickly goes right out the window. Will I be like Saul and blame it on you for your poor driving habits? Or will I recognize that you're actually driving the speed limit? And this is a me problem. I've noticed from time to time when I go back and I reconnect with my family at reunions or with old friends from high school and college, there's this gravity, right? There's this draw that sometimes tries to pull me back into old habits and old attitudes. Remember when I told you that some of those changes I went through, middle school and high school, some of them were positive and beneficial, a lot of them weren't. And so if I am reunited with a friend from 20 years ago or 30 years ago, how quickly do I kind of just fall back into some of those old attitudes? It's easy for me to be the person that they knew me to be. Am I consistent in what God is developing in me, what He's called me to? What am I like when I walk in to my office on Monday morning? Tired, weary, maybe a little frustrated with something that's happened or something that hasn't happened. There are particular venues that encourage better behavior. There are some venues in each of our lives that probably encourage worse behavior. Do we reflect the immutable, consistent, constant nature of God in those circumstances? Am I growing? Do I recognize where I'm inconsistent? And do I work to be more disciplined in those areas? We're called to mimic or to reflect the personality of God that is consistent in every circumstance. Last thought. God's purposes are infallible. The Bible tells us that He has certain plans, and they will come to fruition. In His sovereignty and His ultimate perfect power and His righteous, pure motive, God will see eternity through the way He has always designed it to be. His purposes are infallible. For you and I, this makes Him reliable. It means that if God has said it, we can trust it to be true. This is what we sang about in our worship set this morning. If you've said it, I can believe it. I can count on it. I can rely on it. I can trust it. I can know that it will come to fruition. In Malachi, we see God warning Israel about their unfaithfulness over the years to God. And we see a God who loves them enough to work them back to Himself. And as we look at the message to God's people in the book of Malachi, we see a theme, we see a message that we've seen before in the Scriptures, whether it's in the book of Jeremiah or Isaiah or in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel or the book of Judges, where we see God's people straying away from Him, and His great love for them comes to receive them back, comes to direct them, discipline them, and guide them back into right relationship with Himself. He is absolutely righteous in His relationship with them. Because of His purity, He requires right living of them if they are going to interact with Him in ways that are stable and consistent and healthy. And so He calls them back to Himself. Out of His goodness and His grace and His mercy, He does the same for each of us. Even though we walk away from Him, even though we fail Him on a regular basis. We see it in the story of Balaam. in the book of Numbers. God is bringing his people to the promised land, and as they do so, other city-states, other nations of people see them coming. They hear stories of what they've done to other people groups, and they shudder in fear. And one of those groups of people sees the Israelites moving closer and closer, and so they try to hire a prophet to curse the Israelites. This prophet's name is Balaam. And Balaam prays to the Lord and asks, can I curse the Israelites to preserve and protect the people who already live here? And God says, no, don't do it. The Israelites, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they are blessed, and they will rightfully inherit this land. You cannot curse them. It will not come true. And so Balaam goes back to the king who's hired him to curse God's people. And Balaam says, God is not human that he should lie, not a human being that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Promise and not fulfill what the Lord has said he will do. And the Bible is full of promises and guarantees about eternity in God's presence. He will reign forever in perfect communion with those who love him. The plans of the Lord, according to Psalm 33:11, stand firm forever. The purposes of his heart through all generations. Or the book of Isaiah, remember the former things, those of long ago. He says, I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. He is holy. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say my purposes will stand, and I will do all that I please. It is inevitable. His purposes and his plans are infallible. You can take it to the bank that God's will be done on heaven and on earth. Scriptures are clear that God will exist in harmony with those who align with him, those who love him, those who submit to his perfect order as he maintains it throughout all of eternity. He will not change. He never has changed. He never will change. His eternal end is inevitable. And so we are left with a choice to step into it with him, in perfect communion with him, in perfect harmony with his good desires, or to stand opposed to him, to remain at war against him, resisting all that he desires to do in and through us. He invites us into relationship with him that is reliable, that is relatable, that will come to be. Will you receive him for who he is? The perfect, unchanging God who has always been. God, we love you and thank you for who you are. That unlike all others that we know, you are absolutely consistent in all that you are, in all that you do, in all of your ways. Father, we thank you that you are the same today as you have been for all of eternity past. We also thank you that you promise us that you will never change for all eternity future, that we can see from your holy word what you will accomplish in your perfect sovereignty. And Father, I pray that our hearts would be soft to it. Not just for eternity, not just to be in your presence, but Lord, that our hearts would be soft to what you want us to be. That we would be moldable, that we might be like you. That our character, that our personality would be holy, would be righteous, would be just, and that we would be consistent in it and unchanging as you are. May we worship you for all of eternity, for these perfections of your nature, for these attributes of your personality, and for the ways in which you deal with us.